The new world that so many renegades and heretics left for would prove a safe haven from Charon's hierarchy only for a brief time. With the discovery of the Americas, and how huge this new land turned out to be, the Emperor of Stygia sent his own agents to scout out these lands and, if possible, claim them under Stygia's banners. The Legion of the Black Hawk played a key role in this, as they were composed of hand-picked warriors from all other legions. They ensured that soldiers who died in these new lands were brought into the legions of Stygia, rather than joining the renegades in their anti-imperial agenda. Of course, the first and largest necropoli of the American colonies, New Amsterdam, was situated so far away from Stygia that it took many years and countless souls to construct a byway there. Thankfully, if one can use that word for this situation, there was no shortage of building material, as the European colonials died in large numbers, providing ample souls to construct the pavestones out of. Stygia would continue following in the wake of European empires throughout the world, and wherever these people would invade and claim the lands as their own, Charon's forces would follow, wresting power away from local wraiths and establishing new necropoli. While the legions rounded up the many wraiths of both locals and colonials, it was the hierarchy who stepped up to the task and expanded rapidly to handle this new surge of recruits, ensuring a smooth operation as the Empire of Charon continued expanding. Naturally, this did not sit well with these wraiths who fought back, arguing, and perhaps rightly so, that any wraith who entered the Shadowlands in their domain ought to belong to them. Ironically, the wraiths of the Dark Kingdoms of Obsidian, the Shadowlands of Central and South America, were wiped out, not by Charon's forces, but by the renegades who sought to claim a domain of their own. And while these renegades remained in power for a while, their unfamiliarity with the territory meant that they proved much less of a threat than any local wraiths would have to the Stygian legions. As to their motivation, many renegades would argue that they found the traditions of the Kingdom of Obsidian appalling, inhumane. Yet I must remind the listener that these wraiths most likely saw little issue with how souls were forged into pavement and bricks and swords, forced to spend eternity howling in desperation and pain. The Dark Kingdoms of Ivory and Jade, of Africa and Asia respectively, would broker no peace with Stygia, who they knew had no respect for these kingdoms' authorities, and thus war broke out on three fronts. In the underworld, such a war benefited no one, except perhaps Oblivion itself, for countless wraiths were turned into specters during these battles, joining the forces of the Labyrinth. Eventually, even the three states at war realized this simple truth as well, and a ceasefire was agreed upon. None of them could afford the losses this war was costing them, and thus the Nativity Compact was settled. This concord meant that the wraiths belonged to the kingdom of their origin, no matter where they died. A noble ideal, yet one that could easily be interpreted in one's favor should one so be inclined, which, naturally, all three kingdoms were. The revolutions of the 1700s would prove troublesome for most Stygia-allied wraiths situated in the necropoli where these battles were taking place. Spirits were cast into the underworld filled with the same desire for change and freedom that had driven them while they still drew breath, and the renegades recruited any and all they could find. Of course, the legions in turn would stand ready to do the same with those who might be convinced to work for Stygia, resulting in many wraiths facing the very same enemies they had fought in life, now in death. Stygia itself remained mostly unbothered by these troubled times, however, aside from the occasional lack of soul shipment from the necropoli. The renegades lacked the resources to operate in the heavily protected capital of Charon's empire, and thus its population remained safe and supplicant to their master. The Anacreons, the highest-ranking members of the hierarchy of these beleaguered necropoli, would continuously request reinforcement from the capital until Charon decided to issue an edict that allowed these Anacreons to construct their own legions without supervisions of the Deathlords. Ultimately, this emergency measure would become a permanent fixture, and many of the upper echelons of the hierarchy found its development troubling, fearing that these necropoli might decide they were better off without Stygia's rule. Yet Charon, in his wisdom, would reply to these worries simply with, "They still use swords of Stygian steel," and the matter would rest at that. No one in their right mind dared question the words of the Master of Stygia, after all. With the coming of the Industrial Era, and the continued decline of faith and belief in the immaterial, the Wraiths of the Shadowlands found the Shroud grow ever thicker, limiting their interactions and insights into the Skinlands even more than Charon's edict ever had. Thankfully, whether or not mortals believed in the afterlife seemed to have no impact on where their souls ended up when they died, so there would always be more spirits crossing into Charon's domain. Yet because of the veil strengthening, the necropoli would more and more become the only places where Charon and his agents would gain insight from the mortal realms, and thus the Anacreons would find it their task to not only govern the dead of the necropoli, but also attempt to predict events of the Skinlands in order to catch any opportune moment for souls to be harvested. This, of course, led to further autonomy, which a few of these high-ranking officials welcomed, although some despised their added responsibilities. But most were, however, ready for it, and despite this seeming decentralization of power, the hierarchy would remain functioning. The system had reached a point where it would self-perpetuate, no longer needing enforcement to work properly. The 19th century brought with it a plethora of inventions that radically altered the Stygian Empire, especially the many and varied modes of transportation. Railroads, cars, and steamers were all implemented in the underworld, recreated using soul steel and the know-how of scientists and engineers recruited into the hierarchy. Yet discoveries in the field of medicine and chemistry suddenly rapidly dropped the lethality of many of the illnesses that had plagued humanity for hundreds of years. The legion of the Skeletal Lord dwindled as so few new victims of plagues and sicknesses would come to join their forces, and as workers' rights and unions demanded safer workplaces, the Emerald Legion, fueled by those who had died due to happenstance, likewise found itself threatened. It was also during this time that the Deathlords stopped traveling outside of Stygia. It is not known how the rumors spread, but it soon became clear that the 7 loyal servants of Charon could not visit the Shadowlands, their fetters destroyed or lost to them. This was of course a severe blow to their authority, as they now needed to work through agents they could trust in order to see their work done, and of course that only invited more self-governance for the legions and the necropoli. How these feathers were destroyed is anyone's guess, but it is perhaps no coincidence that this seems to have happened during the 19th century, the very same century where archaeological digs formidably exploded in frequency and popularity. And while many such digs were conducted carefully by learned scholars, the fascination, near-on obsession with artifacts from Rome, Greece, and of course Egypt in the West meant that just as many, if not more, laymen took to their pickaxes and shovels, destroying many ancient objects out of ignorance or carelessness. Did perhaps someone arrange for these specific items and places to be ransacked or destroyed? None can tell. The Deathlords might not even have originated from these places, as they are never seen without their masks of office. But even over a few hundred years, many, if not most, wraiths will see their fetters crumble before they do, if they are lucky enough to remain among the dead, of course. Charon supposedly was not able to traverse the Shadowlands either, so some hypothesized that his fetters as well were destroyed, or that he even destroyed them himself in order to ensure that none of his council, even he himself, could interfere with the Skinlands. Then came the First World War. In its wake it left millions of newly dead, a hierarchy working hard and fast to secure as many as possible, and mayhem on the battlefields, as agents of renegades and heretics fought with legionnaires over the newly arrived, all the while specters daringly plucked whatever souls they could lay their hands on. And while this was going on, the Smiling Lord and the Skeletal Lord, 2 of Charon's Deathlords, would approach civil war as they flung accusations at each other over whether the Quick had not been manipulated into starting this war and developing these tools for murder. The brief period between the First and Second War was fraught with rising tension as the economic depression of the 20s and 30s led to more and more extreme conditions in the Skinlands. And when the Second World War broke out, Charon was quick to mobilize his legions against the Jade Emperor, who had long had a foothold on the west coast of America. Likewise, in Africa, Stygia found itself challenged as war broke out there as well, and plenty of souls that should be theirs were instead claimed by the Kingdom of Ivory. Once more, Stygia's hierarchy was hard-pressed to keep up with the events of the Skinlands, especially since neither of the rival kingdoms had any compact forbidding them from interfering directly with the Quick. Yet, as the atom bombs were dropped over Japan, it instigated another great maelstrom, the fifth, and the second one in less than a century, and the destruction it left in its wake shook Stygia to its core. And, in the aftermath of this destruction, an ancient creature, a Malfean, woke from its slumber and began to rampage across the Tempest. Stygia itself was threatened by the immense strength of Gorul, this great Malfean, and thus Charon took up his blade and steered his reed boat out to face the beast. The two fought until they were devoured by the labyrinth, and no trace has been seen of either of them since. But Charon would be proud to know that the hierarchy functions still without him. The Code of Charon reigned still, and all things slowly returned to normalcy, despite the absence of their great leader. Of course, with his absence also came a great sense of relief and liberation. The Deathlords lacked Charon's personal attachment to the hierarchy's machinery, and they were more than happy to let the necropoli handle themselves as long as the tributes would come in. Bureaucracy, which had previously been the tool of Charon and his Deathlords, would now become the ruler itself, and the hierarchy established itself as the de facto ruling force in most situations. It had to rely on the legions, of course, but the legions and their lords, despite what they may have professed, were just as much, if not more, dependent on the scriveners and administrators of Stygia. The time that followed, the Cold War specifically, forced the hierarchy to adapt. Realizing that the specters of the Fifth Great Maelstrom were influencing the Skinlands in order to push their nations into conflict, it was decided that some small groups of wraiths would be allowed to monitor and, if necessary, intervene should they detect spectre meddling. They would also begin collaborating with the renegades and heretics who, like them, would rather join forces, temporarily, with their enemies than to see an all-out nuclear war, especially considering the consequences the bombing of Japan had had. That the hierarchy remains standing despite all it has been through is truly a testament to Charon's design, for no other government, not even a supernatural one such as the Camarilla of the Kindred, has remained in power for as long and as effectively as the hierarchy. It is efficient, ruthless, and single-mindedly focused on its task, and were it not, who knows what state the Shadowlands would be in. The three grandchildren of Cain wait patiently for the time of judgment to arise. Bambi Parsons, a leader with an unbreakable will, Procyon, who has been reborn as a god amongst Cain's angels, and Dugal, whose thirst for blood is matched only by his strength of will and purpose. Their childer, the Methuselah, control our every move through their timeless jihad. They are Her Satanic Majesty Dani, whose mere presence chills the heart, Maximilian S. Hardcastle, a tutor and master of the jihad, Socrates Johnson, a masterful craftsman of stories, Lauren Eason, a trustworthy ally and friend, and Alexander Kristaria, esoteric scholar and mentor in magecraft. On the council of the Primogen are seated Edward Reed, Ian Nichols, Raven Fang, the Autumn Alchemist, and Michelle Light, wise leaders and of good judgment. This week the council would wish to thank the elder Colin Gifford for your continued insight into matters of our common interests. We would also wish to give our regards to the Ancile Idran, whose service to the council has not gone unnoticed. Thank you for your support. Naturally, all our elders, Ancile, and neonates receive our gratitude from the bottoms of our hearts. Without your support, this would not be possible. And thank you for watching. The wheels of Charon's hierarchy keep turning, yet for how long, and at what cost?